What if Ed Sheeran got into Grindcore? Now you might find yourself asking, why on earth would you put Ed Sheeran and Grindcore together? And how could you possibly have anything against poor Ed? What did he ever do to you? And what on earth is Grindcore anyway? Well, I will attempt to answer all these questions and more in this week's What If, How, When, Why. Hi, my name's Morgan Brown, and each Monday I upload a new What If video to my YouTube channel. The idea of these videos is that every week I pick a popular song and imagine an alternative universe in which some change of circumstances causes that song to come out completely different from the version that we know and love. I then take the original lead vocal of that song and record a new backing track to it using just GarageBand and whatever instruments I happen to have to hand in order to bring that alternative version of the song to life. So the song I picked this week was Sing by Ed Sheeran, and I tried to reimagine that as a grindcore song. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to that yet, here's a little taster. So as I said in my introduction, you might be asking yourself, why on earth would you think of putting Ed Sheeran and Grindcore together? And believe it or not, there is some sort of rationale behind this. Obviously, with doing these videos every week, I keep a bit of a list of different styles of music that I'd like to try out. And Grindcore's been on it for some time because I've been a Grindcore fan for years and it's something that I'm really interested in, something I've always fancied having a go at doing. But it's a tricky one because there's a pretty limited amount of stuff that you can convert to grindcore just because of the fact that grindcore vocals tend to be very much in a growled or screamed style. So really the only original vocal tracks that would fit with a grindcore song are from other extreme metal or hardcore genres. So they wouldn't necessarily make for a particularly dramatic or interesting transformation. So the only other option apart from using, say, a death metal vocal or a hardcore punk vocal would be to take someone's regular sung vocal from a different style of music and then manipulate it to the point where it's unrecognisable. And I'm generally reluctant to do that because it means basically destroying someone's song. Most of the time on this channel, when I'm picking a song, I tend to pick songs that I really enjoy by artists who I really appreciate, with a few notable exceptions. I'll allow you to make your own guess as to which ones those are. But I realised that for a grindcore one, I was going to have to pick something that I didn't mind kind of pretty much totally ransacking. And while I was thinking about this, I was just one night flicking through the channels on TV and stumbled across midway through one of the Bridget Jones's Diary movies. I couldn't tell you which one, but just at a point where there's an Ed Sheeran cameo and he crops up in this film and he's performing at some, I don't know if it's some wedding or a party or something, and then he starts singing, and the song that he was performing was Sing, the song that I've picked for this week's What If. I was just listening to this song and hearing the vocal hook that goes round and round in the chorus and thinking, do you know, with a couple of tiny alterations, if you played that on guitar, that could be a grindcore riff. And once that thought had latched on in my mind, there was no way of escaping it. It was going to happen. So that's how I came to land on Ed Sheeran as the subject for my grindcore reimagining. Now you might ask, why would you want to destroy an Ed Sheeran song? What could you possibly have against Ed Sheeran? And there are a few reasons why I personally don't particularly care for Ed or his music. And I'm not passing judgment on anyone who does enjoy him. I know he's massively popular, but I'm just going to try and explain why I personally don't necessarily enjoy him quite so much as other people do. I don't think he lacks talent. He definitely is a talented guy. He's very good at several things. The first one of which is making money. He's extremely good at that. And the formula that he's found for making money is pretty remarkable in the sense that he has found a sort of musical middle ground between an awful lot of different genres that will appease people who are in the more middle of the road areas of each, if you see what I mean. So an Ed Sheeran record often will appeal to people who might be fond of indie folk, emo, R&B, hip-hop. It will be just about youthful enough to make it onto the Radio 1 playlist. it'll feel just about classic enough to make it onto the Radio 2 playlist. And I don't know if I can think of anyone else who's ever quite managed that level of crossover, if you will. In a way, it's really admirable, but in another way, it's not only middle of the road, it's the middle of several different roads. The blandest possible version of so many different things in order to achieve the broadest possible middle of the road appeal, if you see what I mean. And while it's palatable to a vast swathe of the sort of casual listening audience, it's deeply unpalatable to me. I think as well, although he does definitely have a talent for creating a product that covers a particularly broad demographic, I also think that quite often critics that I read have vastly overestimated his capabilities as a songwriter, because certainly to my ears, an awful lot of the things that he's done have been tremendously derivative musically. I mean, occasionally to the point of being sued. I don't necessarily agree with, like, for instance, the Marvin Gaye plagiarism suit. I'm a little bit dubious on the idea of being able to copyright a really standard chord sequence and a feel. But at the same time, it's just one of many songs that is very obviously deliberately doing something else that someone else has already done 5,000 times better. And Sing, that I picked this week, is a good case in point, being as it is just a kind of total cookie cutter of what Justin Timberlake had been doing a couple of years earlier. So musically, I think he does tend to just be producing a watered down white bread version of something that someone else has done every single time. And his lyrics, I find often shockingly bad as well. I mean, it's all down to personal taste, I'm sure, but pretty much every time I hear one of his songs, there'll be at least one or two lines that I just think, oh my God, how did that ever pass into the final version? The one that always sticks in my head as being particularly bad is that Shape song. I think in the story of the song, he's going on a date with a girl, and I think the bit that particularly sticks in my mind is something about talking for hours and hours about the sweet and the sour and how your family is doing okay. And it's like, this sounds like the most depressing date ever. Absolutely appalling. And then somehow, from having this date where they're just talking about the food and making small talk about a family, they end up having sex, and then the chorus seems to be mainly him sniffing the sheets like some kind of creepy little weirdo. It's just very odd. And pretty much every song I hear by him has something like that that just sticks out like a sore thumb as just either weird or outright bad writing. But I assume it isn't bad writing, and it's just I've got weird taste because it's been massively successful, so what do I know? One of the other things that's always annoyed me a little bit about him, and it's not necessarily his fault, but I think it's more about how people have perceived him. Certainly when he was kind of initially breaking through, people I worked with and stuff started to get into him, and I was being a naysayer, as I sometimes am about these things, and people were going, oh no, but the great thing about him is he's a completely self-made, salt-of-the-earth musician. He came from nothing, he built himself up, he just started as a busker and just through hard work and talent managed to build his following working hard. He was sleeping on people's couches while he was playing open mic nights and all this stuff. There's this kind of myth that's built around him as being this guy who's come from really humble origins. But between reading a couple of bits about him and hearing his Desert Island Discs thing that he did a few years ago, I kind of quite quickly realised that that's not the case at all. He certainly has worked hard, I have no doubt, to get to where he is, but at the same time comes from a very privileged position as an upper middle class kid who went the public school to fame school route with tremendous financial resources and a certain amount of industry nepotism behind him. I think the story that I heard repeated by a couple of people about sleeping on couches while he was playing open mic nights, I think that actually might have referred to staying at Jamie Foxx's mansion while playing industry showcases in LA, which isn't quite the same thing. So I think whether he intended to or not, I don't know if it was anything that he's encouraged or whether it's just something that's built up around him naturally. There is a certain kind of fake, everyman made good sort of aura about him, which just isn't the case at all in reality. So that really is probably the main thing that's prevented me from ever really enjoying anything that he's done. I acknowledge that he's very successful, he's very good at what he does. To me, I just find what he does to be inexcusably bland and middle of the road. I know there have been points where he's shaken things up and introduced new musical elements to the sound. I just thought, maybe he could have gone a little further with that. And one of the ways in which he could have gone further with that would be to venture into the musical territory of grindcore. Now, if you're watching this video because you're an Ed Sheeran fan, and if you are, you've probably already turned off by now, but maybe some of you have hung on just to keep hate watching. If you are, then you may not be familiar with the genre of grindcore, but it's something that I've enjoyed for a very long time. I think I first heard grindcore as a pretty young kid when the Lee Dorian, Bill Steele lineup of Napalm Death appeared on What's That Noise, which was a kind of educational kids music show hosted by Craig Charles back in the 1980s. And somehow he ended up with Napalm Death guesting on there and performing You Suffer, which is their famous 1 second long song, and something else. And it kind of blew my mind. I didn't really understand what it was. It just sounded like this deafening noise, but that kind of intrigued me. And then a few years later, I met a kid who was a couple of years older than me who was into sort of extreme metal. I just kind of started getting into Metallica and things, and so he introduced me to some heavier stuff, so Obituary and Death, and then also Napalm Death. So from him I got a cassette of Scum, the first Napalm Death album, and that was just incredible. And I didn't realise it at the time, but that was probably the first thing that helped me to kind of bridge from kind of thrash metal-y stuff into punk rock, because although I didn't really understand where it sat in the scheme of things, I just thought of it as particularly noisy, gnarly metal. Grindcore exists in a special place somewhere in between punk and metal. I'm in the Grindcore subreddit, and a question that crops up every couple of weeks is, would you consider Grindcore to be part of metal or part of punk? And the answer is always just yes, because really you can't claim a single point of origin for it. Just the state of the punk and metal scenes at that point in the 1980s. It was really emerging from several different directions at once that all kind of converged around 1985-ish. So you can't pinpoint one exact moment where grindcore came into being. Even just to focus on a couple of things, like in the UK, you had Napalm Death, who began in the anarcho-punk scene, and through the early 80s they just gradually start listening to more of the sort of early extreme metal scene that's coming through, bands like Hellhammer and Celtic Frost, and also start hearing some of the other stuff that's coming from the US, some of the more extreme hardcore bands like the sort of Boston and New England area bands, Siege and Deep Wound, who are playing this really kind of hyper-speed, super aggressive hardcore punk, and also the West Coast thrash metal bands who are emerging at the same time, Metallica and Slayer. So they start to add elements of that into their anarcho-punk sound, gradually getting faster and more aggressive. At the same time, you have Repulsion over in the States, who come much more from a straight-ahead metal background, but again, they're craving something more extreme than any of the metal they're currently hearing is offering them, and they're hearing again the faster hardcore bands that are emerging at that time. They're aware of the D-beat scene stemming from Discharge in the UK, and then the bands in Sweden and things who've taken up the mantle of that as well. So this really discordant, aggressive, driving punk rock with this kind of dystopian lyrical imagery as well. So their brand of metal is getting rougher and more aggressive, and again faster and faster, until a point where by like 1986, although they've kind of come from two completely different scenes, both these bands are producing music that you could describe as grindcore. Extremely fast, short bursts of aggressive noise with these rapid tempo changes, these churning down-tuned riffs, little bursts of extreme speed with drumming that became known as blast beats. So yeah, coming from two different angles but arriving at a remarkably similar musical vision, and that's just sort of from two different places. As I say, there was also similar music developing in Scandinavia, there was similar music developing in Japan. Both the metal and punk scenes were pushing in this direction, and there was a really active international tape trading scene at the time, with punk bands sharing what the metal bands were doing, metal bands sharing what the punk bands were doing. So it just became this whole kind of international melting pot of influences. And there are certainly grindcore bands who have made it their stock in trade to literally just be noise. There's some bands who don't bother to actually really write songs. They're just purely improvisational, chaotic noise. But the more you listen to the music, the more you realise that actually an awful lot of grindcore bands are amazing musicians, and some of that music is so complex and intricate, and there's such a variety within the genre as well, from the crude rumblings of the early bands like the electro hippies, the great Wigan band, some of the more kind of technical metal influenced stuff that started coming out of the States, some of the really kind of chaotic experimental avant-garde stuff that emerged a little later like Melt Banana or The Locust. It's really actually become a much broader and more musically diverse genre than I think anyone could have possibly anticipated when they first heard the initial rumblings of grindcore era Napalm Death back in 1986-87. So not a genre for everyone, but I think if you have any fondness for hardcore punk or for the sort of harder, faster edge of heavy metal, there's going to be some grindcore that will really appeal to you, so it's worth investigating. But yeah, anyway, that takes me to this week's alternative universe scenario. So in my alternate timeline this week, we're in an alternative 2013. So Ed Sheeran's at a commercial high. He's had a massive success with his Plus album, I think it was, the kind of massive breakthrough LP. It's made him hugely successful, very rich. He should be on top of the world, but even though he's doing very well, he's still stung a little bit by just a few reviews that he's received that have accused his music of being a little bit pedestrian, a little bit bland, a little bit too safe. And he kind of feels like he really needs to prove those critics wrong with his next record. He's already started working on a track with Pharrell Williams, which is very much along the lines of the kind of thing that Justin Timberlake has been doing for a couple of years, but he started to think maybe that's not quite dangerous enough. Maybe he needs to expand into something completely unexpected to really kind of show those critics. So he goes online, decides to take a new direction by just Googling most extreme forms of popular music, and brings up a big list. Almost randomly decides upon grindcore after a cursory 5 minutes of research. Decides, this is going to be shocking enough. This will show the critics that he's not afraid to take risks. So he impulsively kind of tosses out the version of this song he's been working on with Pharrell, the song obviously being Sing, and gets his team to recruit a new backing band full of musicians from the extreme metal and hardcore scenes, who agree to sign on because it's an interesting project, even if they're a little bit bemused by the whole thing. So he converts this song from a slightly sultry R&B number into a blasting grindcore song with blast beats and these filthy down-tuned riffs, and quickly finds that his attempts at a death growl come out more as a squeak, so he decides that he's just going to sing normally, but he's going to manipulate his voice with an octave effect and some distortion to make it sound like he's got this guttural growl going on. So they record this new version and release it to the unsuspecting public, but it's quite quickly critically savaged and the public reject it en masse. Can't get any radio play. Everyone's horrified, and his record label are absolutely appalled that he's made this decision. So he basically ends up having to beg their forgiveness and promise never to do anything that impulsive again. So he goes back to being safe but incredibly profitable. But yeah, in attempting to convert Sing into a grindcore song, as ever with these things, my first step was just taking the isolated vocal, dropping it into GarageBand and syncing it up to the grid. That done, obviously it being grindcore, I wanted it to be pretty short and sharp and fast, so sped the vocal up to a point that I thought was going to be a good tempo for a grindcore song, and then cut nearly all of it off. So I think we get just past the first chorus and then it just stops. I then obviously needed to try and make it sound more like a grindcore vocal, because Ed Sheeran doesn't sound remotely like a grindcore vocalist. So using the guitar pedal board, I just popped an octave down pedal on. I think I've actually got 2 lower octaves activated on that, so there's a real kind of low rumble coming out of it. And I pitched the whole thing down as well, so it's pretty low and gnarly sounding. I also added a fuzz pedal on there, so it's really just this distorted mess. You can't really make out words anymore. It's just this horrible, low, kind of gurgling noise, which is exactly what I wanted. So we've got the vocal on there. Next thing was programming some drums. So I really wanted that grindcore thing with a bunch of different short sections, really unpredictable, kind of lurching from one tempo to the next. So we've got some slow breakdown bits, some blast beats, a couple of different blast beat patterns, some kind of mid-tempo, D-beat kind of driving bits as well. To that I added some bass. Grindcore bass generally, it's not fulfilling that much of a harmonic function because it's really low and it's really filthy, so it's just mainly a bunch of low growling to fill up the bottom end of the sound. So my bass is tuned down a fourth, so it's tuned all the way down to B. The string's really floppy, so it's probably horrifically out of tune, but you can't really tell because it's so distorted you can't really make out the notes very well anyway. So that's rumbling away there. Guitar-wise, we've got 3 guitars on there. Again, tuned down to B. Normally, if I'm tuning down, I try not to go too low because I can't be bothered to restring my guitars with thicker strings. So down tuning causes tuning instability. For this, I figure we're going for that early grindcore feel, early Napalm Death, extreme noise terror, so just gnarly. If it's a bit out of tune, it doesn't matter. So I just came up with a different riff for each section. So they're chugging away in a stereo pair, and then I wanted a little bit of lead guitar. It's not remotely any kind of accomplished proper playing. All the lead guitar does is come in doing some horrible whammy bar dive bombs on some squealing harmonics. So trying to imagine how I'd be playing if I was a British teenager in 1987 trying to sound like Kerry King from Slayer. And I think I accomplished that quite well. And then for the video, as ever, started off with just some footage of Ed Sheeran performing the song on TV somewhere. I think it's a French TV show that I used a clip from. So tried to zoom in mostly just on him to avoid too much of the other shenanigans because I wanted to try and give the impression that he was performing with a grindcore backing band. Found some great footage of Repulsion to use as his backing band, so they're in there thrashing away. And then I didn't want to go too elaborate with anything else in the brief time that we had, so all I've got other than that is just some cool kind of crowd footage to just get the energy of a grindcore show in there. So I've got just a couple of clips from the excellent Slave to the Grind documentary, which if you haven't seen it, I do recommend it. It's available in full for free on YouTube. Borrowed some crowd shots from that just to convey the atmosphere of a grindcore show in there too. So I hope you enjoyed this one. It's fairly ridiculous, I'm aware, and not necessarily the most pleasant listening experience, but hopefully people will see the funny side and just enjoy it for what it is. I love grindcore, so I really enjoyed making this track. But yeah, let me know what you think down in the comments. If you did enjoy it, please like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. That always really helps. And if there's anything else you'd like me to do in coming weeks and months in the new year, do let me know. I always appreciate your suggestions. But otherwise, that's all from me for this week. So thanks very much indeed for watching, and I'll hope to see you next time.